She was given 2 weeks and a hole in the ground. No deed, no income, no one willing to bet on her. Just a 4-year-old boy on her hip, a sewing kit in her hand, and an abandoned stone cistern choked with 15 years of leaves at the back of the orchard, the same orchard belonging to the family that had just told her she was a burden and shown her the door. Most people would have left. Mae Renshaw picked up a spade. What follows is the story of what one woman builds when she has nothing left to lose and everything left to prove, not with argument, not with anger, but with a needle, a thimble, and a standard of work so undeniable that the same people who cast her out are forced to climb the hill and see it for themselves. But building something real always draws the people who want to take it apart. And when a land agent's letter arrives, 30 days, formal notice, the ground beneath everything she has made suddenly uncertain, Mae will have to decide whether everything she has built is strong enough to hold. Stone by stone, stitch by stitch. A woman turns a hole in the ground into the most talked about place in Cedar Hollow, Kentucky. And some things, once built properly, cannot be undone. The candle inside the cistern throws amber light out past the oiled cloth door, and in the dark of a November evening it looks from a distance like a lantern sunk into the earth itself. Mae Renshaw stands at the bottom of 9 stone steps she cut herself, smoothing her apron with both hands, listening. Above her, through the stone-framed opening in the hillside, she can hear the creak of wagon wheels on the lane, another neighbor coming up from Cedar Hollow, another family who heard the talk at the dry goods counter and wanted to see the place with their own eyes. Eli is asleep in his little cot by the far wall, one arm thrown over the quilt she pieced from flour sacks. 6 weeks ago, this was a hole in the ground. 6 weeks ago, Mae Renshaw had nothing at all. 3 weeks before she ever set foot inside that cistern, Mae sat on the cedar plank porch of the Renshaw farmhouse with her son in her lap and her mother-in-law, Dora Renshaw, standing over her like a fence post driven hard into dry ground. "A woman makes herself useful," Dora said, not looking at her, looking instead at the orchard slope where the apple trees stood bare and gray. "Or she makes herself scarce." Mae said nothing. Eli pressed his face into her collar. She had heard that sentence, in one form or another, since the week she arrived on this farm as a 19-year-old bride. Useful. The word sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. She had been useful every hour of every day, mending, cooking, putting up preserves, nursing the boy through 2 winters of croup. And still the word was aimed at her like an accusation. What Dora meant, Mae understood now, was that usefulness was only recognized when someone else decided to recognize it. That was the thing Mae intended to change, not by arguing, by showing. Cedar Hollow sat in a fold of the Kentucky hills where 2 creeks joined and the road turned to mud for 6 weeks every spring. It was not a rich place, but it was not a desperate one either. The farms here had orchards and kitchen gardens and enough timber on the upper ridges to see a family through most winters without too much want. People knew one another's business the way people do in small valleys, thoroughly, and with a mixture of genuine concern and honest curiosity that was not always easy to tell apart. The Renshaw farm occupied 40 acres on the east slope above the hollow. Harold Renshaw, Mae's father-in-law, had cleared the lower 20 himself 40 years back and passed the work of the upper 20 to his son, James. James Renshaw had married Mae Calloway in the spring of 1881 and brought her home to the farm, and for 4 years the arrangement had been uncomfortable but workable. Then James died of a fever in the January of 1885, and the arrangement became something else entirely. Mae was 23 when James died. Eli was 3. She had no family within 40 miles. Her own parents had moved to Ohio the previous year to be near her married sister, and she had nowhere obvious to go. Harold said she could stay through the planting season. Dora said very little at all, which in Dora's language meant considerably more than words. Mae stayed through planting. She stayed through summer. She put up 40 quarts of tomatoes, 30 of green beans, 22 of apple butter. She mended every piece of clothing on the farm that needed mending. took in 2 neighbors' shirts for the additional consideration of a small coin that she kept in a tea tin under her cot, and looked after Eli through a second bout of croup that kept her up 4 nights running. By September, she believed, in the quiet, reasonable way she believed most things, that she had demonstrated her usefulness past any reasonable doubt. In October, Harold and Dora sat her down at the kitchen table. Harold did the talking. He was not a cruel man. Mae had always believed that. But he was a tired one, and tired men sometimes let cruelty do their work for them without quite realizing it. The farm was smaller than it looked, he said. The apple crop had come in thin 2 years running. There was the matter of the north fence needing replacement, and the barn roof, and the seed money for spring. He used the word burden once, quickly, as though it would hurt less that way. Mae looked at the table. She did not cry. She had learned, somewhere in the last 4 years, to save her crying for private. She had 2 weeks, Harold said. He was sorry for it. Dora did not say she was sorry. Mae spent those 2 weeks in a state of outward calm that cost her considerably. She wrote to her sister in Ohio, who wrote back that the house there had only 2 rooms, and her brother-in-law's work at the mill had gone uncertain, and she was terribly sorry, but there simply was not space. Mae read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in the tea tin with the coins. She had $11.40. She had Eli. She had her sewing kit, a good one that James had bought her the first Christmas they were married, with real steel needles and a proper thimble and 3 spools of waxed thread. She had her own 2 hands and everything her mother had ever taught her, which was considerable. On the 12th day, walking the edge of the orchard for no better reason than that she needed to move and think, she found the cistern. It was at the back of the property, in the steep part of the hill where the apple trees gave out and the sumac and blackberry came in. She almost walked past it. The opening was chest-high, roughly oval, framed by good dry stack stone and choked with 15 years of dead leaves and broken branches. Someone had built it in the old style, before the farm had a well. Built it to collect the runoff from the hill and hold it through dry summers. The well had made it unnecessary, and the hill had gradually tried to swallow it back. Mae stood in front of it for a long time. She thought about $11.40 and rooms with no space, and the word burden spoken quickly across a kitchen table. Then she went back to the house, put on her oldest dress, found Harold's spade behind the barn, and came back. The interior, once she'd cleared the leaves, was larger than she expected. The stone walls were intact, dry stack laid by someone who knew the work, fitted close enough that no water had worked through in the years since it was abandoned. The floor was packed earth, hard and level. The ceiling, if you called it that, was the hill itself, held up by a rough timber frame that still had its strength. The space was perhaps 12 feet across and 9 feet deep, with the entrance at the east face and the hill continuing up behind it. It was a hole in the ground. It was shelter. Mae drove the spade into the floor to test it, and the earth held firm, and something in her chest that had been wound very tight for 2 weeks loosened by one careful turn. She had her 2 weeks. She would not waste them being frightened. The morning of her last day in the farmhouse, Mae rose before light and made breakfast for Harold and Dora, as she always did. Oatmeal, biscuits, the last of the sourwood honey in the blue crock. Eli sat in his chair and ate with the focused attention of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned to be worried about things he cannot see. Mae set the plates. She poured the coffee. She said good morning. Dora watched her over the rim of her cup with an expression Mae could not name. Not unkind, not kind. Something in between that was harder than either. "Where will you go?" Dora said finally. It was the first time she had asked. "I have arrangements," Mae said. Harold looked up. "Arrangements," Dora repeated, turning the word over as though checking it for weight. "Yes, ma'am." She did not say what the arrangements were because saying them out loud would have required more steadiness than she currently had to spare. The arrangements were this. She would move into the cistern. She had spent 12 of her 14 days clearing it, hauling out debris by the armload, sweeping the walls with a bundle of dried grass, testing the timber frame with her shoulder and finding it solid. She had dragged down a piece of oilcloth from the barn loft and tacked it over the entrance as a temporary door. She had set 2 flat stones as a hearth just inside the opening where the draft would carry smoke upward and out. She had, in short, made the beginning of a home out of a hole in the hill, and whether that was ingenious or merely desperate, she had not yet decided. What she knew was this: she was not leaving Cedar Hollow. Eli had been born here. James was buried on the upper ridge. This valley was the only home her son had ever known, and she was not going to let a kitchen table conversation take it from him. She picked up Eli, settled him on her hip, and walked out the door. The first night in the cistern was the hardest. Mae had moved what she owned in 2 trips. Eli on her back in the second trip, the boy's small arms around her neck, and his face pressed warm into her hair. She had the bedroll, the sewing kit, the tea tin, a cast-iron pot she had carried up from the creek house behind the barn where it had sat unused since before James died. She had half a sack of cornmeal, a length of salt pork wrapped in burlap, and a jar of the sourwood honey she had taken from the pantry on the reasonable grounds that she had put it up herself in August. The oilcloth door kept out the wind, but not the cold entirely. Mae built a small fire on the flat stones, coaxed it with dry bark until it steadied, and sat Eli as close to it as was safe. He fell asleep with his head on her knee before she had finished laying out the bedroll. She sat awake for a long time. The arguments against what she was doing presented themselves with great clarity in the dark, as arguments against things tend to do. She had $11.30. She had spent a dime on a paper of tacks to hang the oilcloth. That would not carry her and the boy through winter without some income. A sewing trade needed customers, and customers in Cedar Hollow were sparse. Most families mended their own, and the ones who didn't generally had a grandmother who did. She had no stove, no real floor, no furniture beyond the 2 flat stones. The nearest water was a spring 50 yards down the hill. The entrance, when winter came properly, would need more than oilcloth. She had a boy who was 4 years old and would need feeding every single day regardless of circumstances. Against all of this, she had her hands, her mother's teaching, a good steel needle, and 3 spools of waxed thread. She looked at the stone walls in the firelight and thought about her mother, who had grown up in a 2-room cabin in eastern Tennessee and had never owned more than she could carry but had sewn the most beautiful things Mae had ever seen: wedding quilts, Sunday dresses, a christening gown for Mae herself that had been passed to Eli and still lay folded in the bedroll. Her mother had said once that cloth was the most honest material there was. You put in the work and the work showed, plain and permanent. You could not fake a clean seam. You could not hurry a fine stitch. But if you did the thing properly, it lasted. Mae thought, I can do the thing properly. The next morning she was up before Eli and had the fire rebuilt before he woke. She fed him cornmeal mush with honey and decided to stop arguing with herself because the arguments were settled. She was here. She was staying. The question was only what to do next. She spent the second day and the third doing the things she had not had time to do while the Renshaws were still watching. The packed earth floor she covered with a layer of clean river gravel she carried up in Harold's old tin pail, trip by trip. It took most of 2 days, but when it was done the floor was dry and level and surprisingly pleasant underfoot. She cut a proper door frame shape out of a piece of pine board she found behind the barn and hung the oilcloth from it on leather hinges so it opened and closed cleanly. She built a second shelf from 2 boards laid across stone pegs she hammered into the wall with a river rock. On the 4th day she found, on a walk down to the hollow for supplies she could not do without, that people had already begun to talk. It was Hattie Boone who told her, at the dry goods counter where Mae was spending 40 cents with great care on a pound of dried beans and a small paper of salt. Hattie was a broad, plain-spoken woman of 50, who had lived in Cedar Hollow her whole life and tracked its comings and goings the way some people tracked weather. "Heard you're in the old Renshaw cistern," Hattie said, not unkindly, handing over the beans. "Yes, ma'am." "Harold know?" "It's the edge of the property." "I don't believe he's disputed the arrangement." Harold had not, in fact, said a word to her since she left the farmhouse. She had seen Dora once at the edge of the orchard, and Dora had looked at her for a moment and then looked away, which Mae chose to interpret as neither permission nor objection. Hattie looked at her steadily. "You all right up there? You and the boy?" "We're managing. Cold night's coming." "I know it." Hattie was quiet a moment, then leaned her elbows on the counter. "My Chester's got half a cord of split oak he can't use. I'll have him bring it up if you've got somewhere to put it." Mae felt something shift in her chest, not the tightness loosening further, but something different. Warmth, maybe. The particular warmth of an unexpected kindness. "I'd be grateful," she said. "I can mend for it. I do good work." "I know you do," Hattie said, which surprised Mae because she hadn't known anyone here had noticed. "I've seen the shirts James used to wear on Sundays. That's close work." Mae walked back up the hill with her beans and her salt, and a thing she had not started the day with: a first customer. She sat on the step outside the cistern door while Eli played in the gravel she'd laid at the entrance, and she took out the sewing kit and checked her needles in the afternoon light. Steel and straight, every one of them. One customer, she thought. That's how everything starts. The decision came to her not as a sudden thing, but as a recognition of something she had already been moving toward without quite naming it. She was going to build a sewing business. Not a woman taking in a little mending operation, not the quiet, apologetic kind of work that asked nothing and expected less. A real business. Shirts, dresses, quilts, mending of every kind, done to a standard that people would come back for and tell their neighbors about. Done out of the cistern on the hill, which she was going to make into the most comfortable and well-appointed workroom in Cedar Hollow if it took her all winter. This required things she did not currently have: a proper work table, better light, a second lamp, a system for storing cloth and thread, and enough clients to generate the money those things would cost. It also required that she stop thinking of the cistern as a shelter she was making do with, and start thinking of it as a home she was building on purpose. She told Eli that evening, while he was eating his beans by the fire and she was hemming one of Chester Boone's work shirts by lamplight. "We're going to stay here," she said, "not because we have to, because it's ours." Eli considered this with the seriousness of a 4-year-old receiving important information. "Is it warm?" he said. "It will be," Mae said. "I'm going to make it warm." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his beans. Mae threaded her needle and felt the decision settle into her like a key turning in a lock. Not escape, not endurance. Forward. Ruth Kinney arrived on the 6th day. She came up the hill path in the late afternoon carrying a covered basket and moving with the careful step of a woman whose knees had begun to make their opinions known. Ruth was 61, a widow, and she lived in the small white house at the bottom of the orchard lane that Mae had passed every Sunday on the way to church. They had spoken perhaps a dozen times in 4 years, never more than pleasantries. "Hattie Boone says you're sewing," Ruth said, as though this were the middle of a conversation already in progress. "I am," Mae said. Ruth set the basket down on the stone step. It held a jar of pickled okra, a paper of dried sage, and a Sunday dress with a long tear in the side seam. "This happened at the Hendersons' harvest supper 3 weeks ago," she said. "I've been putting off dealing with it. I can have it to you by Friday." Ruth looked past her into the cistern. Mae had the lamp lit inside, and the fire going, and the mending laid out on the board she was using as a work table. Something in Ruth's expression shifted. Not surprise, exactly. More like a quiet recalculation. "You've made something of this," Ruth said. "I'm making something of it," Mae said. "Not finished yet." Ruth picked up her basket. "Friday, then." She paused. "I'll come back to collect it myself." Chester Boone delivered the half-cord of oak on a Tuesday, stacking it neatly against the hill face to the right of the entrance where Mae had cleared the sumac and leveled a patch of ground for the purpose. He was a quiet man, Chester, broad through the shoulders, and he worked without commentary, which Mae appreciated. When he was done, he stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the entrance. "That's a tight door," he said, meaning it as a compliment. "Pine board and leather," Mae said. "Keeps the draft out." He nodded. "You want I should put a proper lintel stone over it? There's one in the creek bed down the south pasture I've been meaning to move for 2 years. It'd sit right." Mae thought about what she had and what she needed. What would you want for it? Another 3 shirts mended, whenever you get to them. I can get to them this week. Chester came back on Thursday with the lintel stone on the back of his wagon, a fine piece of gray limestone, 4 feet long and 8 inches thick, with a naturally flat bottom face. It took him most of the morning to set it, working alone with a pry bar and 2 wooden wedges, but when it was done, the entrance to the cistern had the look of something built with intention. Mae stood back and looked at it, and something in her settled further. She was beginning to understand that the cistern was not going to succeed despite being in the ground. It was going to succeed because of it. There was something about the stone, the weight and permanence of it, the way the walls held warmth overnight and let it out slowly through the morning, that a wooden house couldn't duplicate. The hillside was a natural insulator. The entrance faced east and caught the morning light. With the lintel stone and the tight door and the firewood stacked close, the space inside was already warmer on a cold night than the Renshaw farmhouse had ever been in her experience of it. She started Ruth Kinney's Sunday dress that same Thursday, spreading it across her board in the lamplight and tracing the tier with her fingertip before she reached for a needle. It was fine lawn cotton, well made, and the tier was clean enough that she could close it with a French seam nearly invisible from either side. She worked until midnight. When she held it to the lamp, she could not find the seam at all. Ruth Kinney came for her dress on Friday and stood in the entrance of the cistern, holding it to the afternoon light for a long time without speaking. "Where's the mend?" she said. "Left side seam, 6 inches from the underarm." Ruth tipped the dress, found the place with her fingers, and made a sound low in her throat that Mae had come to recognize in the weeks since as the sound Cedar Hollow made when it was updating its opinion of something. "How much?" Ruth said. "The dress and the ochre were trade," Mae said. "We're square." "We are not square," Ruth said, in a tone that did not invite argument. She opened her coat, took out a small coin purse, and set 2 dimes on the work table. "That's for the work. The ochre was a gift." Mae did not argue. She put the dimes in the tea tin. Ruth stood in the entrance a moment longer, looking around. Mae had continued improving the space all week. She had hung a second shelf on the west wall for the thread and needles, cut 2 squares of oilcloth to cover the work table and keep the cloth clean, and laid a rag rug of her own making across the entrance to keep the gravel from tracking in. The lamp was on a proper bracket she had fashioned from a bent nail and a board scrap. Eli's cot was along the south wall, neatly made, with the christening quilt folded at the foot. "This is not what I expected," Ruth said. "What did you expect?" "A campsite," Ruth said honestly. "Cold and makeshift, people are saying." She looked at Mae. "People are wrong." Mae said nothing, which was a kind of answer. "I have a neighbor," Ruth said. "Agnes Whitmore. Her daughter is getting married in April, and she wants a dress made, not just altered. She asked me if I knew anyone, and I said I might. Can you do that kind of work?" Mae thought about the question seriously, which was her habit. She had made 2 dresses from cloth and pattern, one for herself, which she had worn until it was past wearing, and one as a gift for her sister's wedding, which her sister had said was the finest thing she'd ever owned. She had never worked from someone else's measurements, or tried to fit a woman she had not sewn for before. It was more complicated work than mending. "I can do it," she said. "I'll need her measurements, and she'll need 2 fittings. And I'll need the cloth. I can source it through the dry goods if she tells me the color she wants." Ruth nodded. "I'll tell Agnes." The Agnes Whitmore introduction turned out to be the door that opened the room. Agnes was a sharp-eyed woman of 45 who ran the Whitmore farm with a competence that everyone in the hollow acknowledged and most found slightly intimidating. She came up the hill on a Saturday with her daughter Lily, who was 20 and pretty, and had very definite opinions about what her wedding dress should look like, fitted through the bodice, full in the skirt, not too much trim, ivory rather than white, because she said white washed her out. Mae listened to all of it, and took her measurements, and wrote them down on the back of an old envelope, and said she could have a muslin fitting ready in 3 weeks. Agnes looked at the cistern. She was the kind of woman who looked at things thoroughly. "How are you heating this?" she said. "Firewood and the hillside," Mae said. "The stone holds the heat." "Practical," Agnes said, in a tone that suggested she respected practical things. And the light? Better in the morning. The entrance faces east. Agnes looked at the work table, the thread, the needles laid straight in their paper sleeve, the rag rug, the tidy shelf. She looked at Eli, who was sitting on the rug with a smooth stone he'd found and was very intent on. Then she looked at Mae with an expression Mae could not quite name. It was not the pity she'd become accustomed to reading on people's faces since October, and it was not the guarded curiosity she'd seen on others. It was closer to assessment, the look a person gives a piece of work they are trying to determine the quality of. "Hattie Boone says you do Chester's shirts," Agnes said. "Yes, ma'am. She says they come back better than they went." "I try for that." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then, "My husband has 7 shirts that need turning, collars and cuffs worn through. Not worth replacing the shirts if the turning can be done right." "Turning can save a good shirt another 3 years," Mae said. "That's what I told him." Agnes looked at her again with that assessing look. "We'll start with the shirts, and then we'll talk about Lily's dress." After they had gone back down the hill, Mae sat on the work table in the thin winter sun that came in through the east entrance, and let herself feel, for a moment, the thing that was growing in her chest that she had been careful not to name too loudly. It was not triumph. It was too early for triumph, and she was too practical for it regardless. It was something quieter than triumph. It was the sensation of a foundation being laid. She picked up her needle. She had 3 shirts to finish before Monday. By the middle of December, Mae had 6 regular customers. There was Hattie Boone with Chester's work shirts, Ruth Kinney with a standing arrangement for any mending that accumulated past what her fingers could manage, which was more than Ruth liked to admit. Agnes Whitmore with the 7 shirts and the promise of Lily's wedding dress after the new year. There was young Tom Hadley from the feed store, who had come up on a Tuesday with a coat needing a new lining, and had stood in the entrance looking at the cistern with the open amazement of a 20-year-old who had not yet learned to conceal his impressions. There was Widow Ferris from the East Road, who kept bees and wanted quilts pieced to a pattern her mother had used, and who paid in honey and occasional small coins and was the best kind of customer. Precise about what she wanted and unstinting in her appreciation when she got it. And there was Mae's newest, a woman named Josephine Marsh, who taught the subscription school in Cedar Hollow and had arrived on a Wednesday with 3 students' coats needing repairs and the information that her own winter coat had a lining that had entirely given up its original purpose. Josephine was 30, straight-backed, curious, and had looked at everything in the cistern with the organized attention of a person who taught for a living. "Did you plan this?" she said, "or discover it?" Mae thought about the question. It was the kind of question she liked, honest and specific. "Both," she said. "I found the bones of it and decided what to make of them." Josephine nodded slowly, still looking around. She had the manner of a person who listened to answers all the way through before forming a response, which Mae found refreshing. "My students," Josephine said. "Half of them come to school in things that are falling apart. Their mothers mend, but they're already stretched thin. I don't suppose you'd consider—" She stopped. "No. That's not a fair question. Ask it anyway. I was going to ask if you'd ever consider teaching mending, to the children, or the mothers. Even one afternoon." She set the 3 coats on Mae's work table. "I realize you have your own work to keep." Mae looked at the coats. 2 had buttons missing. One had a sleeve seam gone at the shoulder. The kind of thing that happened when a coat was put on in a hurry by a child who had already outgrown it. "It's not an unreasonable question," Mae said. "Let me think on it." Josephine left the coats and came back on Friday for them. Mae had the buttons replaced and the sleeve seam reset with a proper flat fell that would not go again, and paid the asking price without discussion, and then stood in the entrance with her own coat over her arm. "You said you'd think on it," she said. "I did think on it," Mae said. "I'll do 1 afternoon, 2 if there's interest. Saturday mornings work better for me than school days." Josephine's face changed in the way faces do when an answer exceeds what was expected. "That's generous." "It's practical," Mae said. "If the children learn to mend, half of them will need better thread in 6 months." That's good for my supply business." This was partly true, and partly the kind of thing Mae said when she did not want to make more of a kindness than was warranted. The first Saturday mending class was held the week before Christmas, inside the cistern, with 6 children between the ages of 8 and 12 sitting on 3 boards Mae had laid across stones as makeshift benches. She had Eli beside her as her assistant, whose official duty was to hold the pincushion and who took this responsibility with great gravity. She taught them to thread a needle, to tie a knot that would not pull through, and to run a basic straight stitch that a garment could actually depend on. It was loud and not at all efficient, and 3 needles ended up in unexpected places before the morning was out. But by the time Josephine arrived at noon to collect the children, every child had completed at least one visible functional repair. There was a girl named Bess Hadley, Tom's younger sister, who had the most natural feel for it Mae had ever seen in a child, a light hand and a good eye, and who stayed an extra half hour after the others left and mended the second sleeve of her own coat without being asked. "You've done this before," Mae said. "My grandma showed me some," Bess said, not looking up from her stitching. "But she passed last year." Mae sat down on the bench beside her and watched her work. The stitch was uneven, but the tension was right. That was the harder of the 2 things to teach, and this girl had it naturally. "Come back next Saturday," Mae said. Bess looked up. "Is that all right?" "I just said it was." The girl smiled, a quick unself-conscious thing, and went back to her seam. After they had all gone, Mae stood in the cistern doorway and looked down the hill at the orchard. The apple trees were bare and still. The Renshaw farmhouse chimney was putting up its usual thin smoke. Everything looked exactly as it always had. But something, Mae understood, had shifted. The cistern was no longer only hers. It was becoming, in small and practical ways, the Hollow's. January came in hard, with 3 inches of snow that lay on the ground for 2 weeks and turned the hill path to iron. Mae had expected the cold to thin her customer traffic. Instead, it seemed to concentrate it. People mending and altering in winter the things they had put off through the busy harvest months, and the cistern, with its stone walls and stored heat and steady lamplight, turned out to be one of the warmer places in the Hollow on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Agnes Whitmore brought Lily for her first muslin fitting on the 2nd Saturday of January, and Mae spent 3 hours with pins and chalk marks and careful questions about where the fit sat wrong. The muslin bodice needed taking in at the side seams and letting out at the shoulders. Lily was broad-shouldered in the way of farm girls and narrow at the waist, and the standard pattern Mae had drafted from measurements alone had not quite captured the particulars of her. Mae made the adjustments with pins and marked each one in chalk, and then removed the muslin and laid it flat on the work table and transferred every mark to the pattern paper with the focused attention of someone doing work that will be seen by everyone in Cedar Hollow, and needed to be right. Lily sat on the bench where the mending children usually sat, wrapped in her coat, and watched. "How did you learn all this?" Lily said. "My mother," Mae said. She was repinning the shoulder seam and did not look up. "She sewed everything the family wore from the time she was 12. Taught me the same way. Put the fabric in my hands and showed me how to let it tell you what it needs." "That sounds like something you'd say to make it seem easier than it is." Mae smiled. "It's not easy, but it gets clear. You start to understand what the cloth wants to do naturally, and you stop fighting it and start working with it instead." She smoothed the seam flat. "Same principle as most things, probably." Agnes was examining the work table arrangement. Mae had reorganized it twice since December, and now had a system she was satisfied with. Thread by weight, needles by size, pins in the pincushion by length, chalk in the tin at the far left corner, where she could find it without looking, and the borrowed dress form Ruth Kinney had unearthed from her attic standing along the west wall for Lily's fittings. "You'd need more table space if the business grows," Agnes said, in the tone of a person thinking out loud rather than making a criticism. "I know it. Harold Renshaw has lumber in the barn he's been meaning to use for 2 years. I happen to know this because he mentioned it to my husband in September." Mae looked up. "I'm not suggesting anything," Agnes said mildly. "I'm just observing that it's there." Mae thought about Harold, who had not said a word to her since October. And about the kitchen table conversation and about the word burden, said quickly. She thought about Eli, who had been born in the farmhouse 20 yards above this hill, and had a right to the valley he'd been born in regardless of kitchen table conversations. I'll think on it, she said, which was what she said when she was already thinking on something. The wedding dress came together through January and into February, and it was the finest piece of work Mae had done in her life. She allowed herself to know this without apology. The bodice fit Lily's shoulders exactly. The side seams curved in at the waist with the clean geometry of a thing made precisely for one body, and the skirt fell in the full, even drape that Lily had described, and that Mae had spent 3 hours cutting and hanging and rehanging until the weight was distributed right. The ivory cotton, good quality, ordered through Hattie's counter from a merchant in Louisville, had the slightly warm tone that suited Lily's coloring exactly. The second fitting, at the end of January, was when Agnes Whitmore made the sound Ruth Kinney had made over the Sunday dress. Mae had come to understand this sound. It was the sound of an opinion being revised upward past where the person expected to revise it. "Mae," Agnes said after a moment. "Yes, ma'am." "When is the last time you slept?" Mae considered the honest answer. "I sleep when Eli does. That's usually adequate. You need a lamp that doesn't smoke." "I know it. I have one. It was my mother's, better quality than anything Hattie stocks. I'll bring it Tuesday." Mae started to say she could pay for it in work. Agnes held up one hand. "Consider it an investment," Agnes said, "in the person doing my daughter's dress." That Tuesday, Agnes arrived with the lamp, a fine brass student lamp with a clear glass chimney that burned clean and bright and cast twice the useful light of Mae's current arrangement, and set it on the work table without ceremony. She also brought, in the basket on her arm, a paper of good waxed thread in 3 weights, a new paper of needles, and a jar of the apple butter from the Whitmore fall pressing. Mae looked at all of it laid out on the work table. "I'll make Lily the best dress in this county," she said. "I know you will," Agnes said. "That's why I'm here." By February's end, the word had traveled far enough that Mae was turning away work she could not fit in her schedule. This was a problem she was glad to have and careful about. She turned away nothing that was simple or quick, a button, a hem, a torn pocket seam, because the simple work was the bread and butter, as her mother used to say, and you did not refuse bread and butter because you were also baking cake. What she declined, politely, was the more involved work that would have required her to neglect the dress or the existing customers who had been there since November. The Saturday mending classes had grown, from 6 children to 9, and now 3 mothers who arrived with their own work and sat in the back while their children learned. Mae had borrowed a second lamp, Josephine Marsh's, which Josephine had offered without being asked on the grounds that better light was a requirement of good work, and she had a lamp going unused, and the cistern on Saturday morning was bright and warm and filled with the sound of needles pulling thread through cloth and the occasional satisfaction of a successful knot. Eli had graduated from pincushion holder to sweeper, keeping the floor clean of thread ends with a brush Mae had made from a bundle of dried broom corn. He was very serious about this role. One Saturday morning in late February, Bess Hadley came in with a length of calico she had bought with her own pennies and asked Mae to teach her to make a simple drawstring bag. It was not a hard project, but it required cutting on the straight of grain and a clean running stitch and a neat hem, and it took Bess most of the morning, and when she was done the bag was even and true, and she held it in both hands and looked at it with an expression Mae recognized from her own earliest sewing. The particular astonishment of having made something real out of raw material. "I made that," Bess said. "You did," Mae said. Bess looked up. "Can I make something bigger next time?" "Next time," Mae said, "we'll make a proper apron." Bess's face arranged itself into the specific delight of a person given permission to do the thing they most wanted to do, and Mae thought, watching her, that this was possibly the best use to which the cistern had been put so far. Not because it would earn anything, because it was right. Lily Whitmore's wedding dress was finished on the first Saturday of March, and Agnes brought Lily up the hill for the final fitting on a bright cold morning with a hard blue sky. Mae had ironed the dress with the smoothing iron she had acquired in February, traded for a month of Chester Boone's mending, and hung it on the peg by the east wall where the morning light would fall across it. When Lily stepped into it, and Mae laced the back, and Lily turned to look at herself in the small mirror Agnes had thought to bring up the hill for the occasion, the cistern was entirely quiet for a moment. Then Lily made a sound, not the Ruth Kinney sound of revised opinion, but something younger and less contained, a kind of breathed happiness. "Oh," she said. Agnes stood behind her daughter and looked at Mae over Lily's shoulder with an expression that needed no translation. Mae felt something she had been working toward all winter arrive in her, quiet and solid, like the final stone laid in a dry stack wall. She had made the best dress in Cedar Hollow. She had done it by lamplight in a cistern in the hill. She had done it because she was good at it and had done the work properly, and not cut corners and not let herself doubt when doubt would have been the easy thing. She had proven the thing she set out to prove, not to Dora Renshaw, not to Harold, to herself. Now she understood was when the real work could begin. She was not surviving. She was building. The trouble had been building for a while before Mae became fully aware of it, the way weather builds on a far ridge and looks like nothing until it is very close. It started with small things she noticed and chose not to make too much of. The fact that Harold Renshaw, twice in February, had walked the edge of the orchard at a time of day when there was no particular work to bring him there. The fact that Dora had come down to the hollow on a day Mae had happened to be at Hattie's counter and had not spoken to her, but had watched her from the other side of the store with an expression Mae could not read from that distance. The fact that Josephine Marsh, arriving for Saturday class one morning, had mentioned, in the careful way she mentioned things she thought might be significant, that she'd heard Harold had been speaking with a man named Covington at the county seat. Mae had not heard the name Covington, she asked, carefully. Covington, Josephine said, was the county land agent. He handled property disputes and recorded property transfers and was generally the person you visited when you wanted to determine, officially, where one piece of land ended and another began. Mae sat with this for 2 days. The cistern sat at the back corner of what everyone in the hollow understood to be the Renshaw property. Mae had never had a document saying she could use it. Harold had never given her permission precisely. She had simply moved in while he had not yet said no, and he had continued to not say no for 4 months, and in Mae's experience of the world that was often how arrangements got made. But it was not a lease. It was not a deed. It was an assumption layered on a silence, and she understood now, with the precision of someone who had thought about it for 2 careful days, that it could be ended at any time Harold chose to end it. She went to see Ruth Kinney. Ruth was the person Mae had found most useful to consult on matters involving the complicated human geography of Cedar Hollow, because Ruth had been here for 61 years and remembered everything, and could be trusted to say what she knew without decoration or omission. Ruth listened. She poured Mae a cup of tea without being asked, and set it in front of her and let her finish before she said anything. "Harold's not a vindictive man," Ruth said, "but he is a proud one." "What does he have to be proud about in this situation?" Mae said, and then immediately felt the uncharitable sharpness of the question and set it aside. "I mean, I haven't done anything against him." "You haven't," Ruth said. "But the cistern has become a matter of conversation in this hollow, and the conversation is not always kind to Harold and Dora." She looked at Mae steadily. "When you make something people admire, Mae, the people who cast it off are going to hear about it eventually." Mae had not thought about it from that direction. She had been so focused on the work itself, the sewing, the customers, the classes, the business she was building piece by piece, that she had given very little thought to how it was landing at the farmhouse 20 yards up the hill. "Dora's pride," Ruth said more gently. "That's what you're dealing with. Harold does what Dora points him at. She pointed him at Covington, I'd wager. What can Covington actually do?" Ruth was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she knew the answer and was deciding whether to say it plainly. "If Harold wants you off the property, a land agent can establish where the property line is and serve you formal notice. You'd have, in this county, I believe, 2 weeks to remove yourself and your belongings from land you have no document for." 2 weeks? The same as the kitchen table. Mae looked at her tea. She thought about the lintel stone Chester had set over the entrance, and the wood stacked against the hill, and the lamp Agnes had brought, and the rag rug, and the work table, and the shelf with the thread organized by weight. She thought about Bess Hadley learning to cut on the straight of grain, and Eli sweeping the floor with his broomcorn brush. "I see," she said. "Now," Ruth said in a slightly different tone, the tone of a woman who had been thinking ahead of the conversation for several minutes. "There are other things that can happen on a property, things that are a matter of record regardless of who owns the ground." Mae looked up. If a structure on a property is improved by a tenant, properly improved, documented, and witnessed, and the tenant has given value for the use of that structure, documented, witnessed, there are circumstances under which the tenant has a claim on the improvement, if not the land itself. Ruth set down her cup. "That is not legal advice. I am 61 years old and not a lawyer. But I am a woman who has read every document this family has ever needed to sign, and I know what questions to ask." Mae was quiet for a moment. "Then, what questions would you ask?" Ruth smiled. "A small private thing. I'd ask whether anyone ever wrote down that you moved in." Mae spent the next week doing two things simultaneously: continuing to work, because stopping would have been both frightening and foolish, and thinking systematically about what Ruth's observation meant in practical terms. The answer she arrived at was imperfect, but not nothing. She had never signed a paper with Harold. He had never asked her to. But there were other papers, small ones, informal ones, the kind that accumulated without ceremony in any working life. She had the envelope she had written Lily's measurements on, with the date in Mae's handwriting at the top, and a note of the agreed price. She had 3 receipts, carefully kept in the tea-tin, from customers who had written down what they paid and what for, with the address simply as the Cistern, Cedar Hollow. She had a letter from Josephine Marsh confirming the Saturday classes and the arrangement of the lamp loan, which Josephine had written without being asked, being the kind of person who wrote things down as a matter of professional habit. None of these things said Mae had a right to the space. But together they made a record of a business operated from a specific location over a specific period of time, and that, Ruth had implied, was not nothing. She brought everything to Ruth, who laid it on the kitchen table and examined each piece with the thoroughness of a woman who had once managed an estate settlement herself after her husband died, and had learned at some cost exactly what paperwork could and could not do. "This is useful," Ruth said. "Not sufficient by itself, but useful." She looked up. "You need a witness, someone who can say, if asked, that they saw the work being done and the customers coming and the money changing hands. Someone of standing in this county." "Agnes Whitmore," Mae said immediately. Ruth considered it. "Agnes Whitmore would be believed," she said. "Yes." Mae went to Agnes the next morning. She brought the receipts and the letter and the measurements envelope and laid them out on the Whitmore kitchen table, while Agnes stood across from her with her arms folded and her face doing the careful listening thing it did. When Mae had finished, Agnes was quiet for a moment. "You're asking me to be a witness," Agnes said. "I'm asking whether you'd be willing, if it came to that. It may come to that. It may." Agnes unfolded her arms and looked at the documents, and then at Mae. "Mae," she said, "I came up that hill in January because Ruth Kinney told me you were the best seamstress in the Hollow and I wanted a good dress for my daughter. What I found was—" She paused, choosing words. "Something I did not expect. You have built something real, from practically nothing, in 4 months, in a hole in the ground. I watched Lily put on that dress and I have not seen my daughter look like that in a long time." Mae said nothing. She was holding herself very still. "Whatever Harold Renshaw thinks he's going to do," Agnes said, "I will stand next to you in front of any man in this county and say what I saw. Yes, of course I will." Mae let out a breath she had not known she was holding. That same week, the Saturday class grew again. 4 more children, including the 2 young sons of a farmer named Willis from the East Road who had heard about the classes from Tom Hadley at the feed store. Mae had not advertised any of this. It spread the way things spread in small valleys. one conversation reaching the next. An observation passed across a dry goods counter, a neighbor mentioning it on the way to church. And then on Thursday of that week, Dora Renshaw came down the hill. Mae was at the work table when she heard the footsteps on the path, and she knew them, knew the particular deliberate quality of them, a step that did not rush and did not hesitate, before she turned around. Dora stood in the entrance with her hands at her sides and her expression arranged in the neutral way she kept it when she was managing something that cost her. Mae set down her work and stood up. They looked at each other for a moment across the work table, and the lamp and the pincushion and the organized thread. "I've been hearing things," Dora said. "I expect so," Mae said. Dora's eyes moved around the space, the shelves, the rug, the cot where Eli was napping along the south wall, the neat stacks of mending waiting to be done, the dress form Mae had borrowed from Ruth, on which she was currently draping the beginning of a second commission. Her expression did not change in any way Mae could name, but something in it shifted, the way a held breath shifts a face when it is let out slowly. "You've made something of it," Dora said. Mae recognized the sentence. Ruth Kinney had said it on the first day. Mae had answered then that she was still making. She gave Dora the same answer. "I'm still making," Mae said. "Not finished." Dora looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Eli asleep on the cot. "He's grown," Dora said. "Children do," Mae said, and kept her voice even. Dora turned and went back up the hill without saying anything else. And Mae stood in the entrance watching her go, and did not allow herself to feel the complicated weight of that small exchange until Dora had gone out of sight among the apple trees. The letter from the county land agent arrived on a Monday. It was delivered by a boy on a horse who handed it to Hattie Boone at the counter and asked her to see it got to the cistern, and Hattie brought it up herself rather than trust it to anyone else, which told Mae something about how the Hollow was already reading the situation. The letter was from a Mr. W. H. Covington, land agent, Cedar County, and it was written in the careful official language of someone accustomed to delivering unpleasant news with as much impersonal precision as possible. It noted that the parcel described, which was unmistakably the cistern, was the legal property of one Harold J. Renshaw of Cedar Hollow. It noted that no lease or formal arrangement existed between the property owner and the current occupant. It advised the current occupant that the property owner had requested a formal review of the occupancy, and that a determination would be made within 30 days as to whether the current occupancy could be permitted to continue. 30 days. Not 2 weeks this time. A month. Mae read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the tea tin with the receipts and the other documents. Hattie was watching her. "What does it say?" "It says Harold has hired a land agent to look into the matter of the cistern." Hattie was quiet a moment. Then, in the tone of a woman who had spent 40 years watching Cedar Hollow conduct its business, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to work," Mae said, "and I'm going to find out what the law actually says." She sent a note to Ruth that afternoon, carried by Tom Hadley, who was coming up for his coat buttons, and Ruth sent back a note by return with an address. A man named Hartwell in the county seat, a lawyer who handled what Ruth called common people work, wills, property questions, the practical legal business of people who did not own the kind of land that sustained a county lawyer in comfort, but who needed honest help nonetheless. Ruth said she had known Hartwell's father, and that the son was a straight dealer. Mae looked at the address, and at the tea tin, and at the lamp Agnes had brought, and the lintel stone Chester had set, and the rag rug and the dress form borrowed from Ruth, and the row of children's coats hanging on the pegs by the entrance waiting for Saturday. She thought about everything that had been built, one careful piece at a time, through 4 months of early mornings and late lamp-lit nights. She thought about 30 days. Then she put on her coat and went to find Tom Hadley before he left. Tom Hadley agreed to drive her to the county seat on Wednesday, which gave Mae 2 days to prepare. She spent Tuesday organizing everything in the tea tin, which had grown considerably since October. She arranged the documents in order by date: the early receipts from Ruth and Hattie, the measurements envelope with the Whitmore dress commission, Josephine's letter about the Saturday classes, 3 more receipts from January and February customers, and a short note Agnes had written on her own initiative the previous week after their conversation, stating plainly what she had witnessed at the cistern over the course of the winter. That last document Mae looked at for a long time. Agnes had not asked for direction in writing it. She had simply written what she knew in her own clear hand and signed it. The gesture had the particular quality of the lintel stone Chester Boone had set over the entrance, a solid thing placed without ceremony by a person who understood what was needed. She also wrote out, by lamplight Tuesday evening, a full account of the improvements she had made to the structure: the door, the lintel, the shelves, the gravel floor, the hearthstones, the firewood stack. She noted the dates as best she could remember them, and the materials used and the labor involved. She did not estimate a value. She did not know how to do that. But she wrote the account in the clear, factual way she wrote most things, without apology and without exaggeration. Eli watched her write from his cot. "Are we going somewhere?" he said. "Wednesday," Mae said, "to see a man in town." "A good man?" Mae thought about it. "I believe so. We'll see." Eli considered this. "Can I have the smoothing stone while you write?" Mae handed him the flat river stone he used as a favorite toy, and he lay back on the cot and turned it in his hands with great seriousness, and Mae worked until the lamp began to sputter, and then trimmed the wick and kept working until the account was finished. She read it back by the low light. It was 4 pages in her careful handwriting. 4 pages documenting 4 months of work. The gravel, the door, the shelf pegs, the classes, the customers, the income carefully tracked to the penny. 4 months of a life being built, stone by stone, on a hill in Cedar Hollow. Whatever Mr. Covington's letter meant to accomplish, it had not accounted for the fact that Mae kept records. She folded the 4 pages and put them in the tin with everything else, and banked the fire and went to sleep. The lawyer named Hartwell had an office above the feed and grain store on the main street of the county seat, reached by an outside stair that creaked considerably. He was a small man in his mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that unhurried was usually faster than rushed. Mae laid the documents on his desk in date order and watched him read them without speaking. Tom Hadley had waited with the wagon. Eli sat beside Mae on the bench against the wall, turning his smoothing stone. Hartwell read for a while. He read the Covington letter twice. "The property is unambiguously Harold Renshaw's," he said, not looking up. "I know it. You have no document establishing your right to occupy. I know that too." He looked at her over the reading glasses. "Then tell me what you think you have." Mae had been thinking about how to answer this question for 2 days. "I have a record of 4 months of labor that improved a derelict structure. I have witnesses who saw it. I have income earned from a business operated at that address, documented from the beginning. And I have—" She stopped. "Mr. Hartwell, do you know what the cistern looked like before October?" "I don't." "It was full of 15 years of leaves and broken wood. The stone was sound, but everything else was gone. I cleared it and made it habitable and set a door and a lintel and a hearth and a business. Harold Renshaw did not do any of those things. He did not spend $1 on that structure in 15 years. Hartwell looked at the documents again. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, there is a principle in Kentucky property law, established in case precedent, not statute, that recognizes the claim of a tenant who has materially improved an abandoned structure with the knowledge and acquiescence of the property owner." He paused. Acquiescence meaning he knew, didn't object, and benefited, indirectly, from the improvement. Mae thought about Dora's face in the entrance. "You've made something of it." "He knew," she said quietly. "He walked the edge of the orchard twice in February. He could see the door and the lintel from there." Hartwell folded his hands on the desk. "Then you have something," he said. "It may not be a deed, but it is something." Mae straightened her back. "Tell me what to do," she said. On the Friday of the following week, Mae returned from the county seat after a second visit to Hartwell, who had drafted a formal response to Covington's inquiry on her behalf, documenting the improvements and invoking the precedent he had described, to find that someone had removed the lintel stone. It was simply gone. The entrance looked wrong without it, the top of the opening bare and rough the way it had looked before Chester spent his morning setting the stone. She stood in front of the entrance for a long moment. She went inside and checked that everything else was intact: the shelves, the lamp, the dress form, the mending in its neat stack. Everything was as she had left it. Only the lintel stone was gone. She sat on the work table edge in the lamplight and let herself feel, for the first time since October, the full weight of what she was contending with. She was 24 years old. She had $11 in the tea tin after paying Hartwell's modest fee. She had a 4-year-old son and a sewing kit and a cistern in the hill that she did not own and could be removed from at 30 days' notice. She had built something real and true and good here, and there were people 20 yards up the hill who were willing to dismantle it, literally stone by stone, rather than acknowledge it. The lamp threw its amber circle on the stone walls. Eli was at Ruth's for the afternoon. Mae put her face in her hands and allowed herself, finally, to cry, not from despair, but from the simple exhaustion of carrying so much so carefully for so long. She sat for a while. The fire was low and she did not build it up. Outside, the early spring afternoon was moving toward evening, the light going soft and gray through the east entrance. She thought about Ohio. She thought about her sister's 2-room house and her brother-in-law's uncertain millwork, and the letter still in the tea tin that said there was no space. She thought about whether there might be space now, a year later, or whether she could find something else in that direction, a town, a position, work she could do with her hands in a place where no one knew her and no one's pride was at stake. She thought about how easy it would be to leave, to pack the tin and the sewing kit and the christening quilt and Eli's smoothing stone and walk down the hill and not come back. And then she thought about Bess Hadley sitting on the board bench with a needle and a calico scrap, looking at a finished drawstring bag with the expression of someone who has just understood something important about what their hands can do. She thought about Ruth Kinney's face over the Sunday dress, the sound she had made, the 2 dimes set on the work table. She thought about Lily Whitmore saying, "Oh," a single soft syllable, turning in front of a small mirror in a cistern in the hill. She thought about all of it. The customers and the classes and the lamp and the lintel stone and the gravel floor she had carried up bucket by bucket, and she felt the weight of it not as a burden, but as substance, as evidence, as the thing she had made when someone told her she had nothing and nowhere. And she thought, I am not going to let one removed stone undo 4 months of building. She lifted her face from her hands. Here was the truth of the situation as she could see it clearly, in the low firelight, without the noise of the day. Harold Renshaw had hired a land agent and removed a stone. He had not come himself. He had not sent a formal notice. He had not spoken to her. He had done the small, sideways things that a man does when he is not entirely comfortable with what he is doing. That discomfort was something she could work with. She was not going to fight Harold. She was not going to argue or accuse or make the situation into the kind of public dispute that would leave everyone diminished. She was going to do the thing she had always done when faced with a wall. She was going to find the place where the mortar was loose and press there, steadily, with patience, until the wall decided to become a door. She knew now what that place was. She dried her face with the corner of her apron. She rebuilt the fire. She put the kettle on the hearthstones and waited for the water to heat, and while she waited she took out her needle and her thread and the mending that was due on Monday, and she began to work. By the time the tea was ready she had a plan. It was not a complicated plan. That was how she knew it might actually work. The plan had 3 parts. The first part was Hartwell's letter, which had been sent to Covington the previous week, and which established formally that the occupant of the cistern had a documented claim to the improvements made to the structure. That letter was now a matter of county record. Harold could not unrecord it. The second part was the Saturday class. Mae had, over the winter, taught 9 children and 3 mothers to mend. She had asked nothing of them except attention and effort. but she had, in the process, built a set of relationships that the hollow understood as a kind of fact, a thing that existed, that people had a stake in continuing, that would be diminished if the cistern were lost. The third part was the simplest. She was going to ask Harold Renshaw to come down and look at what she had built. Not to argue, not to present Hartwell's letter, or invoke legal precedent, or ask for anything at all. Simply to look. To see the lamp and the work table and the gravel floor and the dress form and the pin cushion and the rag rug and everything that had been made of a hole in the ground that he had let sit unused for 15 years. She believed, not sentimentally but practically, that a man who looked at something real and good and true had a harder time undoing it. She was going to give him the chance to look. On Saturday morning she held the class as usual. She had told none of them about the lintel stone or the land agent's letter. There would be time for that later if it came to it, and she did not want the morning to carry the weight of her worry. The children came up the hill in the bright cold of early April. The first real warmth of spring was just beginning to work through the air, and the Renshaw orchard was budded, the trees showing the first pale green of coming leaves. Bess Hadley arrived first, as she always did, and began arranging the board benches without being asked. The Willis boys came next, and then the others, in ones and twos. Mae taught a lesson on darning, the proper way to weave a repair over a worn place so the new thread supported the old, building strength rather than just covering weakness. She had brought a piece of wool with a deliberate hole in it to demonstrate, and she worked through it slowly enough that everyone could follow, and then set each child to practice on a swatch she had cut for the purpose. The room was loud with work. Eli went around with his broom-corn brush, sweeping the floor between the benches, with the air of a person who has a job and takes it seriously. The three mothers in the back were deep in their own mending, talking in the low, comfortable way of women who have found a reliable hour to themselves each week. Mae was helping one of the Willis boys, the younger one whose stitch tension was still inconsistent, when she became aware of a shadow in the entrance. She looked up. Harold Renshaw stood at the top of the entrance steps. He was wearing his good coat, not the farm coat, the brown one he wore to church, which told Mae something about how he had been thinking about this visit. He had his hat in his hands. He was looking at the room. Mae straightened. She held the Willis boys' piece of work in her hands. The class had gone quiet. Children have a fine sensitivity to changes in an adult's composure, and the room had caught it. "Good morning," Mae said. "Morning," Harold said. He looked at the children. At the benches Mae had built from boards and stone pegs, at the lamp on its bracket, burning clean in Agnes's good brass fixture, at the dress form along the west wall, at the shelf with the thread and the pin cushion and the needles in their paper sleeve. "I'll come back," he said. He meant after the class. "The children finish at noon," Mae said. He nodded and went back up the hill. Mae stood for a moment and then turned back to the Willis boys' darning. "Your tension is right on this row," she said. "See how the weave sits flat? That's what you want." The boy looked down at his work with renewed focus, and the class went on. At noon the children filed out. Bess Hadley last as usual. She always stayed to straighten the benches. When she had gone, the three mothers following behind with their mending baskets, Mae put the kettle on and waited. Harold came down at 12:05. He came alone. Mae had expected that. Whatever this was, he had not wanted Dora to see it. He stood in the entrance and looked around the empty room the way you look at a place that is quiet after being full of people, with the particular attention you give something when the people are gone, and the thing itself is all there is to see. Mae poured him tea. He took it. They stood on either side of the work table. Mae had set it clean, the mending stacked to one side, the lamp in the center, the brass fixture catching the noon light from the east entrance and throwing it warm across the stones. Harold looked at the gravel floor. "I didn't know about the floor," he said. "It keeps the damp down," Mae said. "River gravel." He nodded slowly. He was a man who understood the language of practical improvements, and she had spoken to him in it, which was exactly what she had intended. "I didn't know about the children," he said. "The classes." "Every Saturday since December." He looked at the board benches. At the broom-corn brush Eli had left propped neatly against the wall. "Eli well?" he said. "Very well. He's at Ruth Kinney's this morning." Harold turned the teacup in his hands. He was a man who had a difficult thing to do and was working up to it, and Mae had enough patience to let him work up to it in his own time. "Covington's letter," he started. "I received it," Mae said. "I've responded through a lawyer in the county seat." He looked at her. There was something in his face that was not surprise and not quite shame. Something in between that sat uneasily on a proud man's features. "The lintel stone," he said. "That was—" He stopped. Mae waited. "That was wrong," Harold said. "I'll have Chester put it back." Mae held very still so she wouldn't show what that sentence did to something in her chest. "I'd appreciate that," she said. Harold stayed another 20 minutes. He did not make a speech, and Mae did not require one. He walked the perimeter of the cistern the way a man walks a piece of work he is trying to understand. Slowly, pausing at the shelf, the hearthstones, the rag rug. He asked about the door frame. She told him, pine board, leather hinges, fitted to keep the draft out. He asked about the timber ceiling. She told him what she knew. It had been sound when she arrived, and she had given it a good look each month since and seen no change. "Good dry stack work in these walls," he said, speaking to the stone. "Whoever built it knew their craft," Mae said. "My father," Harold said. "He built it the first year they were here, before the well." He touched the wall with one hand, briefly, then let it fall. "When the well went in, nobody thought about it anymore," Mae thought, "and 15 years of leaves and broken wood." She did not say it. "Mae," Harold said. He turned around. He was looking at the work table, not at her, which was how she knew this part was going to cost him something. "Dora thinks—" He stopped. Tried again. "Dora believes she was acting in the interest of the farm. In October. You understand that?" "I understand she believed that," Mae said carefully. "She was wrong about the cistern," he said. "She said as much to me last week. She didn't say it easily." Mae absorbed this. She thought about Dora standing in the entrance in February, looking at everything that had been made of the space Dora had called unfit for living. "You've made something of it." The particular constrained way she had said it, the way a proud woman says a true thing that argues against herself. "I'll send Covington a letter ending the inquiry," Harold said. "This week." Mae looked at the lamp. "I'd like to make a proper arrangement," she said. "Something written, a lease, fair terms, documented." Harold nodded. "I'll have Hartwell draw it up." "You know Hartwell?" "I do. He's a straight dealer." A pause. "Ruth Kinney sent me a note 3 weeks ago, before the land agent, before any of it. She said I should come down and look at what you'd done before I made any decisions." Mae was quiet for a moment. She thought about Ruth pouring her tea and saying, "You need a witness, someone of standing in this county." Ruth had been working on this from multiple directions at once, quiet and methodical, and Mae felt a rush of warmth for the woman that she would have to express later in something more substantial than words. "I should have come sooner," Harold said. He put the teacup down on the work table. He looked at Mae directly for the first time since arriving. "I'm sorry, Mae, for October, for the way it was done." She had not expected an apology. She had not planned for one. She had built her entire approach on the assumption that she would need to move around his pride rather than through it, and finding that his pride had opened a door, however narrow, where she had not thought to knock, left her momentarily without the careful phrasing she had prepared. "Thank you," she said. It was the truest thing she could say, so she said only that. When Harold had gone back up the hill, Mae stood in the entrance and looked out at the orchard. The trees were greening fast now, that particular early April pace when the buds open almost overnight, and the bare gray branches turn, in what seems like a single morning, to something full of light and noise. Eli came back from Ruth's at 2 o'clock, running up the path ahead of Tom Hadley, who had collected him, and when he came through the entrance his eyes went immediately to where the lintel stone was not, and his face arranged itself into the specific 5-year-old expression of someone who has noticed a change and is waiting to understand it. "The stone's gone," he said. "Chester Boone is going to come put it back," Mae said. "Tomorrow." Eli considered this. "Why'd it go?" "Someone made a mistake," Mae said, "and then they said so." Eli turned this over. "That's good," he said finally. "Yes," Mae said. "It is." Chester came the next morning, Sunday, with the lintel stone on the back of his wagon. He did not ask questions about where it had been or why it was returning. He simply worked, pry bar and wooden wedges, and an hour of careful labor. And when he was done, the stone sat over the entrance as before, 4 feet of good gray limestone set square and level, looking as though it had never left. Mae made him tea and gave him the 3 shirts she owed him, turned collar and cuffs, saved from the rag pile for another 3 years, and he drove back down the hill, and she stood in the entrance with the morning sun on the limestone and felt something she could only describe as the completion of a course correction. The world had gone sideways for a while, and now it was right again. Lily Whitmore's wedding was in 6 weeks. The dress was finished and wrapped in clean muslin on the dress form. Mae had 3 new commissions waiting. The lease was drawn up by Hartwell the following Wednesday, signed by Harold on one side and Mae on the other, with Ruth Kinney and Agnes Whitmore as witnesses. It was a 10-year lease at a rate of $12 per year, payable in quarterly installments of $3, which Mae could manage with 2 weeks of ordinary work. It included the cistern and the area immediately surrounding it, the firewood pad, the approach path, and a 20-foot radius of the hill face, and contained a clause, drafted at Hartwell's suggestion based on the precedent he had researched, that recognized Mae's improvements to the structure as her property in the event the lease were ever ended. Mae sat at Hartwell's desk and read every line before she signed. She had learned, the hard way, the difference between a word spoken and a word written, and she would not rush this. When she had signed, Hartwell handed her the copy and said in his unhurried way, "You've done good work here, Mrs. Renshaw. Not many people in this county would have managed what you've managed." "Thank you," Mae said. And then, "I had help." She did not downplay the help. She had been the one with the spade and the needle and the plan, but Ruth had given her the questions to ask, and Agnes had given her the witness, and Chester had given her the stone and the wood, and Hattie had carried the letter up the hill herself, so that Mae would have it in her own hands. And Josephine had written the letter without being asked because she was the kind of person who wrote things down, and Bess Hadley had stayed an extra half hour on a cold December morning because she had something to learn, and Mae had something to teach. You did not build something from nothing. You built it from everything people were willing to give you, and you gave back in kind. And that was how a community became one. By May, the Saturday classes had 15 regular students. By June, the week after Lily's wedding, at which the dress was, by general agreement, the finest thing in the church, Mae had hired Bess Hadley as a proper part-time assistant, paying her a small wage from the sewing income to help with the mending queue on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Bess was 13 now, and her stitching had come on to the point where Mae trusted her with work she would have done herself 6 months ago. Agnes Whitmore sent 2 more commission dresses Mae's way in the summer, recommendations given without being asked, and one afternoon in late June, Dora Renshaw came down the hill with a tablecloth that had a long tear in the center seam and set it on the work table without preamble. Mae picked it up and examined it. "This is good linen," she said. "My mother's," Dora said. 40 years old. I've been putting off dealing with it." Mae thought of Ruth Kinney standing in the entrance in December with exactly those words about a Sunday dress. She thought of how things moved in circles in small valleys. "I can have it to you by Friday," she said. Dora looked at her, a long moment. Then something in her face moved, shifted, opened. "Friday," she said, and the word this time had nothing but an ordinary afternoon in it. On an evening in August, Mae sits at the work table with the lamp burning clean and bright, the brass fixture Agnes brought in January throwing its steady amber circle across the stone. The cistern is warm. It holds heat the way stone always does, slowly earned, slowly given back, the hill itself a partner in the keeping of it. The gravel floor has been augmented with 2 braided rugs, May made in the spring, and the work table has been extended with the lumber Harold brought down in April, saying he had no use for it, which they both understood to mean something more than that. Eli is at the table doing his letters on a slate Josephine brought him. He has started at the subscription school this fall, and takes to it with the same grave concentration he gave the pincushion in December. Through the east entrance in the long summer evening, the orchard is heavy with apples coming in. May can hear faintly the sound of the Boone wagon on the lane below, and below that the sound of Cedar Hollow settling into its night. She threads a needle. She has a wedding quilt to begin, a commission from a family on the North Road, 2 sisters who both quilted and wanted something made by someone they had heard would do it right. She draws the first stitch through the cloth, ties the knot that will not pull through, and smooths the seam flat. Through the entrance, the first stars are beginning to come out above the ridgeline, and the apple trees stand in the long light, and the cistern on the hill throws its warm amber glow out into the August dusk. A lamp sunk into the earth, a home. Thank you so much for watching the story all the way to the end. It truly means the world to me. I hope the story kept you company and maybe took you somewhere new for a little while. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving the video a hype and dropping a comment down below letting me know where in the world you're watching from. I always love reading those. It amazes me every time just how far these stories travel. If this is your first time here, welcome. There are plenty more stories waiting for you on the channel, so feel free to stay and explore. And if you've been here before, thank you for coming back. It means more than you know. Sharing the video with a friend who loves a good story is also a wonderful way to support the channel. I'll see you in the next story. Take care.